But I think it's important to note that he told his own story. You know, I mean, it was not very common for a black man. This was in the late 1920s when he came around to actually publish the story, basically self-published the story, and then he sold his book.
Good evening. Welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. My name is Steve Guerrero. I'm the Director of Education here, and it's my honor to welcome you here for our talk tonight about Major Taylor. Major Taylor was not only a world-class cyclist, but also a trailblazer, competing and excelling at a time when segregation and racial prejudice created enormous barriers for athletes of color. His triumphs, both on and off the track, make him one of the most significant and inspiring figures in American sports history. His partnership with the Waltham-based Metz Company is a point of local pride, with Taylor riding their cutting-edge Orient bikes as he cemented his place in the golden age of cycling innovation. Tonight, we're excited to have two outstanding speakers to bring Major Taylor's story to life. Todd Balfe is a prolific writer and the author of Major, A Black Athlete, A White Era, and the Fight to be the World's Fastest Human Being. Todd's research not only uncovers Taylor's athletic brilliance, but also delves into the personal and societal battles he faced as an African-American athlete in a deeply segregated America. Joining Todd in conversation tonight is Lynn Tolman, another dedicated cyclist and the president of the Major Taylor Association, which is committed to preserving Taylor's legacy and educating future generations about his incredible achievements. Lynn has done extraordinary work ensuring that Major Taylor's story continues to inspire. Please join me in welcoming Todd and Lynn.
I want to thank Lynn for joining me. You know, Lynn and I have known each other for quite a long time. I think we first met, we were talking, you know, earlier this week, and I think we first met maybe at the Major Taylor Association has the George Street ride every year. And this is maybe one of the first years that I showed up. I think it was, you know, the book came out in 2008, but I was doing research in the years before that. And I think I had just done the Mount Washington road race. So I was feeling pretty good about myself when I showed up at George Street, and then I saw that hill, and the idea of sprinting a hill was kind of new to me. You know, like you survive a hill, like, you know, Mount Washington, but that, you know, my son, who was 10 years old at the time, was there with me, and that was one of the first times that he knew that Dad was not so mighty. After I did, he's like, Dad, what happened up there? I'm like, I don't know. So, but it was a great event, and we'll talk some more about, but I think that, you know, when I wrote the book in 2008, there were a couple of excellent books out there already. One of them was Marshall Taylor's own book, his autobiography. And there was also Andrew Ritchie's superb biography of Taylor. And, you know, I guess what I was looking to do with my book was tell a narrative story. And it felt like it kind of presented itself well for that. I mean, in a way, you're kind of cherry picking the best events from a career. And I think for me, the arc was really from his start in Indianapolis to all the way to Australia, where he raced for Floyd McFarlane, you know, that would have been in 1904. And, you know, I think at the time I was thinking that maybe, you know, I could flesh out sort of what Major was thinking about during those times, but I also wanted to try to do some more research into the characters that supported Major. that was Bertie Munger, his trainer, and the guy who built one of the best bikes of the era, the Bertie Special. And, but also the promoter that Billy Brady, who was also a Broadway producer, who came and was promoting his events. And, so there was some, and also Major's wife, Daisy. And so there was some rich characters that I hoped to find out more about, and hopefully I did, and hopefully that was what the book presented. I think that, one of the things I was influenced by was a book that I had read as a younger person, which was by John McPhee, which was called Levels of the Game. And that book was about a single tennis match at the US Open between Clark Grabner and Arthur Ashe. And it was really an incredible book because it brought to bear not only the contest of the tennis match and the high stakes that it represented, but also it was about race. It was Clark Grabner was white, Arthur Ashe was obviously black. They had completely different cultures that they were from, and that they were heritage were totally, and they were trying not only to play a match, but they were trying to understand one another in that match. And when I kind of saw the parameters of the Major story, I felt like it was, there was sort of, that book was present in my mind in trying to tell that story. But I'm kind of interested from Lynn's perspective, what brought you to Major Story and how you started the association?
I first learned about Major Taylor from a book. I was writing, this was in the 1990s, and I was writing the cycling column for the Worcester newspaper where I worked, for the Worcester Telegram and Gazette. I think the book where I first saw a mention of Major Taylor, and it said he was from Worcester, was a book about the Tour de France, which Major Taylor never had anything to do with. But it said he was from Worcester, so I looked him up in the newspaper's library, and I wrote a column about him. And when some other people stumbled onto that story a couple years later, actually, and they were like, hey, we should have a statue of this guy in Worcester. Let's put up a statue. And I said, good luck with that. I didn't know what it cost, where would it go, how do you get a site, this could be political. I just said, keep me posted and I'll write about it. And then I got roped in, and then I ended up spearheading the fund. It took us about 8 years to raise the money and a couple more years to get it done. So the statue went up in 2008, right when Todd's book came out, which was really good timing. And the Major Taylor Association has stayed in existence since then as an educational clearinghouse, resource center. And the thing that we never could have predicted is that Major Taylor cycling clubs would sprout all over the country, and now we have some overseas too. There's about 100 of them. A few of them have come and gone, or gone dormant, but a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are clubs that were started by people of color, consist primarily of people of color. None of them is exclusive, but have really contributed a lot to diversity of the sport. And now there's a whole separate umbrella organization called the Major Taylor International Cycling Alliance that has that does a lot of networking among the clubs, and they have they call it a convention, but it's a ride fest. They have a big gathering every year. So next year it's in June. It's going to be in Los Angeles. I went to the one this year in Chicago, and it's just kind of mind-blowing to see hundreds and hundreds of cyclists, a lot of them people of color, and all in their team jerseys, and everybody's all about Major Taylor, and they call themselves the Major Taylors, which actually happened in Major Taylor's own day. Right. When he started riding in Worcester with a club called Albion Cycling Club, that was Black Club. They started calling themselves, he was their star, and pretty soon he moved on, but they called themselves the Major Taylors.
Lynn also, I think when we started talking too, I mean, she was in contact with the family of Major Taylor. And, I don't know when that association began, but, Lynn would, kind of hear from a lot of different writers along the way, and she was sort of the gatekeeper a little bit to make sure, right? I mean, that the family, there were some wild requests of the family, and there was really, he did an amazing job in protecting and, their interest, I believe.
Well, for a while, Major Taylor's descendants, they didn't want to handle the questions. They couldn't handle the questions. They hadn't done the research. It was Major Taylor's daughter, and when she was in her very old age, like in a nursing home and stuff, like she was the one who knew this stuff, and she wasn't talking anymore. So there were years when the family just wasn't. So then they were kind of happy that there was somebody like the Major Taylor Association to field the questions. Now they're doing more.
Yeah.
Including they've kind of lawyered up, and a little bit of licensing and trademark stuff, but
because they were kind of got burned a little bit, right? Because they getting into the weeds a little bit, but I mean, basically, somebody came along and took the trademark or the Major Taylor name and started to license gear with that brand and that name. And suddenly the family kind of found out what was going on, and then they had to get lawyers to basically win the family name back and own it again, which is not, I guess, isn't as uncommon as it sort of sounds like it is, but I guess it's not really.
And it isn't really about money. They're not trying to make money or prevent other people, but they, they want to make sure that justice is done to the name, that the name isn't misused.
Right. And I think when I was kept calling, and I was, I met with the two great-granddaughters, and one of the things, Sydney, which was Major Taylor's daughter, was still alive. She was 100 years old and was in Pittsburgh, and I was really interested to see her, of course, just to have a touchstone to Major Taylor himself, and understandably they were concerned. They wanted to limit the how much exposure she had, but they were great, and I was actually able to spend some time with her at that point. She died, I think, a year or so later, but she had a photo of her son, on her dresser in her room, and I mean, I came and I was very excited, and I was like reading, there's a whole slew of love letters, basically, of that Major wrote to his wife, Daisy, and I just wanted to read some things, and I was just like, I mean, what was I thinking, really? But I mean, I just sort of like maybe there would be a moment where I could see her reaction, and she wasn't talking really that much, but I mean, it was still. It was beautiful to spend a little bit of time, and I really indirectly thank Lynn and also the family.
I never met Sydney.
Yeah.
I never talked to her. My contact has been through Sydney's grandchildren, primarily two of her granddaughters. One who lives here in Cambridge, and the other one lives in Hawaii, but has come back here for the George Street Bike Challenge and for other Major Taylor related things.
Yeah. But I think it's important to note that he told his own story, I mean, it was not very common for a black man This was in the late 1920s when he came around to actually publish the story, basically self-published the story, and then he sold his book in Chicago, where he was living at the time. I don't know if he sold it in Worcester as well. Yeah.
In fact, there was an older guy in Worcester who told us that he remembered as a teenager meeting Major Taylor at a car dealership when Taylor was selling copies of his book. And so yeah, he was selling it in Worcester, and then he hit the road. He was selling copies out of the trunk of his car. He went to Chicago, and that's where he lived the last couple years of his life.
Right. But I think that, and the book is, it's kind of quirky. It has some, these, but it gives you a flavor. I think the book, in addition to the, he also, Sydney, his daughter, saved his news clippings scrapbooks, which gave, any sort of researcher or writer a window into what he thought was important in telling his story as an autobiography, but also what was important, why he clipped the things he clipped. And of course, there's races after races that that would tell the stories in various newspapers and magazines that were prevalent at the time. But also there were clips about, things that socially were happening at the time that he was interested in, about race, there were advocates, I forgot, I'm blanking on her name, but I mean, it was clear that I think there's been some debate about how politically active he was, and he wasn't really, but I mean, in some of those clippings, it was clear that he was aware of what was happening around him, and the people that were, that were speaking out, speaking the truth, and I think that what I thought about was, was he not speaking out because he was obviously aware what was happening, but maybe he wasn't speaking out because he didn't feel like he could, in his position as a racer, as somebody who was trying to earn a living and knowing how fine a line he was on.
The way I always put it is during his racing career, he let his legs do the talking.
Yeah.
He was just focused on, let me win, and I'll show that way. But I think he was, even though he wasn't, say, politically active, he definitely stayed aware of current events and stayed on top of things. We know he and Booker T. Washington, prominent black leader of the time, there was mutual admiration there. Booker T. Washington brought a group of his students to the docks in New York to see Major Taylor off to Europe. In 1902, Major Taylor had a portrait of Booker T. Washington hanging in the living room of his house in Worcester. Major Taylor corresponded with W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the editor of Crisis magazine of the NAACP. I think when Major Taylor was writing his autobiography, he asked if he could get some chapters like serialized in the Crisis magazine, and that didn't happen. But obviously it was a magazine that he read, and so he definitely stayed on top of things. And yet we still don't know. It's so hard to get into. It's never going to fully be possible to get into the head of someone from 100 years ago. For example, there was a KKK rally in Worcester in the 20s, just a few miles from Major Taylor's house, and that was front page news, all kind of, that was all over the papers and everything at the time. But it's not something he ever mentioned in his book, so we have no idea. How did he feel about that, or what did he think about that?
Right.
We have no idea.
Right. Some of these, I just want to kind of go back to the 1890s a little bit and understand what kind of era this was. There's some of my favorite quotes here, but I think that I mean, it's hard not to fall in love with this era. I mean, it is, anybody, and I think a lot of the people in this audience love bikes, and it's, you kind of want to be dropped into the 1890s sometimes to understand the craze, to understand how everything was built and being built about bikes and riding bikes, and and the numbers of manufacturers who are building bikes, the people who are riding bikes of all classes, really, even though bikes were not necessarily the cheapest things out there. I mean, we'll see some price tags of like $100, $125, which in today's dollars were several $1,000s, but I think that, this era was quite remarkable in a lot of different ways, and I know myself, I get excited about it, and, even to the point where these days I'm riding a hand cycle, right? And a few years ago, I was reading a story in the late 1880s, was by a woman, a Boston woman who was a writer, and she did a ladies' tricycle tour of the North Shore, from Malden to Gloucester, and it was in Outing magazine, and it was a brilliantly written article, and I said, like, let's retrace that route. And so with a couple buddies, and me with my trike, we did that route again. And I mean, some of us dressed up in period, costumes as well, just for the kicks. But I mean, this era just makes me, it just is such an evocative era for bikes and people who love bikes. And, I think Lynn's probably has some thoughts as well, but.
One thing that comes to mind about that, about just how huge bicycling was, we always say it was more popular than baseball at the time. My whole career has been in newspapers as a reporter and an editor, and to see the newspaper coverage of just a little local race in Worcester, and it was all 6 or 8 columns of the front page, jumping into 2 or 3 more pages on the inside. You don't get that kind of coverage of the Tour de France today, and this is a mainstream paper, which is nothing to say of the cycling press.
And the classifieds of those, I mean, and even of the New York Times, if you go through 1896 and those years are just amazing, page after page of bikes and other accessories to bikes, and everything that you thought was new had basically been invented and done, more than 100 years ago.
I think Worcester at the time had about 35 bicycle makers.
Yeah, right. This is another slide here. Shows the Boston Globe here with a cutout doll of you probably know Zimmerman's story, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Zimmerman was a world champion. He was one of Major Taylor's idols. Major Taylor got to meet him when Major Taylor was just a kid in Indianapolis. He was working for Bertie Munger, his mentor, coach, employer, and one day it was Major Taylor's job to go fetch Zimmy from the train station. Zimmerman was coming into town for a bike race. He had been the high wheel champion in the earlier era, and so Major Taylor got to talk to him on the carriage ride back to Bertie's place, and then he got invited to sit down to dinner with Arthur Zimmerman and Bertie Munger, and he wrote in his autobiography that how impressed he was at the generosity and the broad-mindedness of these champions. So that really made an impression on him. And Zimmerman had written manuals, training manuals and stuff, and that was what Major Taylor followed. So that was a thrill for him to meet his idol. Another one he met at that same race was Willie Windle from Millbury, another champion.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
right.
he wrote how impressed he was at that. He said, I'm not going to quote this exactly right, but in his autobiography, he said something like, men can be champions and still be broad-minded. And this is, he was writing his autobiography decades later, but that was something he really remembered.
This painting by Edward Hopper, I think, turns out that he was a big fan of bicycle racing. And, he grew up in Nyack, New York, and he went to the six-day races. And even later in life, even in the 30s, he ended up going, and his wife was like, why are you going, what are you doing, but this was, and there's some sketches that he made of, there's a great sketch of where he is, and this is a feeling that everyone in this audience probably knows, but it's just a line sketch, and he's looking at his poor bike on the ground, and he has the wheel off, and it has a flat tire, and he looks absolutely morose at the side. So, but I mean, yeah, this was something that he painted in 1937. So we talked about a little bit about the race, and this was something that. This is, I think chronologically, some of these slides will start to run here, but I mean, basically, in 1895, Major moved to Worcester in Massachusetts from Indianapolis, where he was raised. And, at that time, he was traveling with his mentor, Bertie Munger, who had in Worcester had a manufacturing place that he was developing his own bicycles, the Bertie Special, which we mentioned earlier. But, I think that you just sort of kind of wonder Major kind of had eyes wide open. In Indianapolis, he faced segregation. He was, he at one point had actually tried to whiten his face with chemicals just to be able to enter one of the top races in Indianapolis. Coming to Massachusetts was, despite, what he encountered elsewhere, was really his first opportunity to race in first-rate races, and which I think Lynn can also speak to as well.
Well, when you were talking about the bicycling craze of the 1890s and how it might be fun to be in the middle of that, at the same time, the same decade was, this is like the dismantling of Reconstruction. This is the harshest period of racism in this country, violently enforced by, there were more lynchings in the 1890s than any decade up to then. So contrast those two things, the bicycle boom and all the opportunity that brings, and at the same time, the racial climate. So yeah, they did hope, Munger and Major Taylor hoped that the racial climate would be better in Massachusetts for this young protege. And you can see in this quote from a New York newspaper here, it wasn't. He was thrilled to be able to join the YMCA in Worcester. He had been excluded from the Y in Indianapolis, and that really stung him as a child. So, and that working out at the Y, lifting weights, really helped with his training. He was pleased beyond expression, he wrote about that. So some things were better. He raced in this area, Cambridge, Waltham, with white riders as their equal, people that did not question his right to be there in the sport. So in some ways, things were better, but not entirely.
Right. I think his kind of breakthrough was, this is a photo, I think it's 1908, so it's not exactly right, but the Major raced a 6-day race of his own in 1896, was really his breakthrough on a national stage. This was a huge event in Madison Square Garden. Thousands of fans coming in and out of the building day after day after day. And, this was such a unlikely event for a teenager, B, a born sprinter who was not an endurance athlete, of one of these kind of, stamina sort of crazed, athletes that were in this type of race. But I think that, for the people that were advising him at that time, both, Bertie Munger as well as the promoters, it was sort of in a way a very cagey and smart move, because if he survived, he was not going to be forgotten, and he also did some sprinting as an exhibition around this event as well beforehand. And he did survive, barely. He came in 8th place, he did 1,700 miles, something like that, yeah.
But in that exhibition, in that half-mile race before the 6-day grind, he beat the national champion,
Right.
Eddie Ball. So yeah, this event really vaulted him onto the stage for the spectators, for the cycling press, for the promoters, for the other racers. Right. This was a guy to watch.
And I don't remember what this track, how the length of it, but it was, comparatively tiny, right? Can you imagine doing 1,700, 2,000 miles on a tenth of a mile track or whatever it was? It's just, crazy.
He was hallucinating from fatigue. He thought somebody
right.
was chasing him with a knife.
Right.
Yeah.
And, there was a generous use of stimulants with other racers that may or may not have been also for Major as well. He might have not known it, but they were just doing whatever they could to keep him riding, as was the case with the other racers as well. Just a quick, this is the Birdie Special, which Munger built, in Worcester, and it was really a high point of his artwork. His artistry, and by all account, it was a brilliant cycle. But the company only lasted a couple of years. It turned, he went bankrupt after in 1898 or 1899. And I think, the picture that kind of comes out of Birdie was he was a great designer, terrible businessman. And, even when we showed that slide of him, of the garden, Madison Square Garden. In 1896, they did a huge unveiling of this very bike, and it was black tie, it was fanciness, and it was excess, and all the rest. And you just have a sense that the cost overruns must have been just enormous, and ultimately his company became the Worcester Ice. I think it was Ice manufacturer or something, but yeah.
Oh, on the same site,
yeah.
where the notorious Worcester warehouse fire in 1999, the Worcester cold storage. That's that's where the bike factory was, in that same complex.
Right.
With so many bike makers at that time, there was bound to be a shakeout, and the Munger's company was one that did not survive. Black versus white. So this is how they promoted the race. So this is 1898 in Charles River Park, which you just saw, head-to-head, Major Taylor versus Eddie McDuffie. And I, to this day, just wonder, how did Major Taylor feel about this type of promotion? Did he feel exploited by this, black versus white? It worked. It totally worked, because no matter no matter who you were as a spectator, whether you wanted to see the black guy win or whether you wanted to see white supremacy upheld, you wanted to see it.
Yeah.
You were going to pay your money at the gate. I don't know how much it costs to get into this. I know that Boston versus Philadelphia race was 50 cents. I saw an ad for that.
Is this here in Waltham? This place?
Charles River Park is in Cambridge.
Yeah. And yeah, right.
Yeah. So, and this was a long race. This was 30 miles, which was McDuffie's forte. That was middle distance. It was not really Major Taylor's thing. And McDuffie was having the best year of his career in 1898, and McDuffie won this one. Yeah, and I don't know if it's big enough for you to see what it says under the silhouette of Major Taylor here. It says an off color yesterday.
Yeah, right.
But you can see the quint and the triplet, the multiple rider pacing machines. There's a picture behind you of a 10-person machine that that the Orient Bike Company here in Waltham made, called the Orient, play on the Orient. But that's how they picked up pace, was drafting behind these big machines until the motorized machines came in. So yeah, so we could go back to that Charles River Park picture. So that took place at Charles River Park, which was new in 1897 in Cambridge. And Larry Finnison and also the Sarah Burks from the Cambridge Historical Commission helped me out with what I'm going to tell you about this now, because trying to figure out where this is. Well, the entrance to the park is at Mass Ave and Lansdowne. Now it's Novartis. Used to be the Necco Candy Factory. But something's off about this picture if you know that part of town, and it's not that close to the river. So there's a little artistic license in this
here we have
lithograph here.
Yeah, right.
Actually, where it shows the Esplanade, and you can see the Quint, the 5-man bike there. There was actually a railroad there. The railroad tracks are still there. And then there was about 3 more blocks of land before the river.
This is like, there was no MIT yet.
Right. So that piece of land was known as the embankment. And now it's where MIT Stadium and tennis courts and all their athletic stuff.
It was really the premier, kind of one of the premier racetracks, I think, and it kind of lasted even longer, I think, than the Waltham track, right? I think maybe.
A lot of velodromes came and went really quickly during that time, and a lot of cities had them. Worcester had one called the Coliseum that only lasted about a year.
But I think,
the other thing about this race that was on that button was the purse. I think it said $15,000. That's a lot. That's a lot of money.
100. Yeah, right.
So McDuffie is
This
one.
This
that
one.
guy.
Yeah.
So this was the previous year in 1897. This is thought to be one of the earliest photographs of an integrated professional sports team in America. So this was a 5-man team that was formed for one race, Boston versus Philadelphia. It was a pursuit race on the track, so the 2 teams start on opposite sides of the track and go in the same, and it's a pursuit because if you catch up, then you're going faster and you're winning. So that's the object, to catch the other team and pass them. So you would take turns drafting and
this was at the Charles River.
this was at Charles River Park also. So these guys had trained together. They were actually, I always thought this picture was a little odd in the pose, like a little lopsided. Why would you pose 5 people and not in that formation? And so it turns out that there were more than 5 that trained together, and then at some point they decided which ones were going to be on the squad, and they had substitutes also. Again, Larry Finnison is the one who put me onto this. There is another version of this picture, same negative, but there's 7 people in it. So that balanced it out a little more. And that one was published later. This picture, the 5-man shot, was the one that was in the press at the time of the race. It was in a bike magazine called Bearings.
It's 1897, right?
So I think what they did was in the dark room, burned out those other two guys once they decided this was the squad and these are the ones you need the picture of. So a little 19th century Photoshop. There was one other thing about the 7-man picture that you notice also. When it was published a couple years later in 1899, when the League of American Wheelmen, the governing body of the sport, and also the umbrella for the amateur side of the sport and the recreational side, they had their annual meet in Boston, and on the program cover was the 7-man picture. And the other thing that's different besides the other two guys in it is that Major's jersey doesn't say Comet. Comet was the name of the bicycle he rode back then in '97, but by '99 he was under contract to Stearns, and they changed that too. His jersey says Stearns. It was probably in his contract that he couldn't wear somebody else's name.
Which is, a classic. I think a lot of the story accounts at the time were really describing, what Major was, under the gun all the time in these races, 1897, 1898, 1899, especially in the pack races that he was doing, where they often would, a lot of times the outcome was sort of sometimes fixed, and sometimes, Major was not, he was boxed in, and so oftentimes he just had to be that much faster, that much, better really than the rest, and he would have to get outside the box technique, and he would sprint, and sometimes he would win. But I mean, oftentimes there was a lot of scrum that was happening in these races, and I think that you would see. I think this really culminated, I think it was 1898, where there was this famous race in Taunton, Mass., which was at the fairgrounds, Bristol County Fairgrounds, I believe, where Major was in a race which he lost to, it might have been McDovey, I can't remember, but the third place finisher, when the race was done, came up to Major, hauled him off the bike, started choking him and strangling him for several minutes until people were able to get involved and pull him off. But he had to give some ammonia rag to bring him back to life after he was choked. I think that this California writer got a $50 fine, which he may or may not have paid. So, I think you got a sense in those, especially those first several years, how violent and really, Major would even said, I think in his autobiography, that he had a dread of injury. Like he felt like, you could imagine he's still a teenager, still riding against, grown men, and he's fearing for his life.
And he did not wait until his autobiography to say that. There were headlines at the time where he said, "I'm in fear for my life every time I get out there. These guys are going to injure me. They've already done so." But there were times when he got pushed into the fence, when he got knocked down. He was strangled into unconsciousness that time. And William Becker was the assailant. He was from Minneapolis. And he was fined $50, and other white riders offered to chip in and pay it for him.
This is an interesting quote, because this was from a black newspaper at the time, and there was the knowledge that, people were coming to see him. They weren't really coming to see a lot of the other racers. And, that was also speaks to why he was part of these promotional posters, because, he was the drawing card.
And people were just thrilled at the speed, too. Don't forget, this is when automobiles and aviation are in their infancy, so a human being on a bicycle is the fastest thing going, next to a locomotive train. And people were just thrilled to see the speed. This is before derailleurs. They're all one speed. If you wanted to change the gear, you manually took it off and put on a different different one. And they were big. You can see in the bike that's on display here, you're pushing some big gears.
Yeah, you can even see, this was
Yeah, look at the size of that.
yeah, this was the Orient, which was made right here in Waltham. And, you know, just a classic pose. And it was interesting, there was, I saw somewhere there was, you know, I think there was a, you know, a poster, for, you know, made for this, you know, that was promoting the bike, and it was said something like, the first American cycle that has ever held the world hour record. It was kind of interesting wording, you know. It doesn't say Major Taylor holds that, but just, you know.
I don't think he had the hour record, and maybe that wasn't him.
Yeah, I wonder though, yeah.
But he had different, he was one of the first black athletes to have corporate sponsors too, something you kind of take for granted now if you excel in your sport that, you know, Nike is going to come calling. But he was sponsored by Ivor Johnson bikes, which were made in Fitchburg. He was sponsored by the Orient, made here.
Right.
He rode Stearns. The Sager chainless gear was another whole thing that...
Which is right here, actually. This is it right here, yeah.
What's it called?
Sager, a guy named Harry Sager.
Yeah, so it's a chainless,
Built a
you
gear
know,
mechanism, but it's on an Orient.
it's on the Orient, and it was kind of the big buzz in 1899, and the whole idea was to push this idea of this type of new bike, and Sager held these sprints and these in Chicago, and the idea was McDuffie was on, I think he was on a Columbia bike that had a chainless version, and Sager had Major Taylor on it, and there was a big purse to see who could, you know, who could break the record and who could sell these bikes. There was an interesting post about this particular innovation, because it turns out that, you know, this was not a very efficient, you know, shaft drivetrain, and that it was, you know, and Major set the record, you know, in those speed trials, but, you know, despite the technology, you know, the technology was not really up to stuff at all.
And the records had a lot to do also with the pacers. Now they're into motorized pacing machines. They can go faster and faster. You can draft them, and then they peel away, and you go. So partly it was a competition of the pacing machines. He did return to chain-driven bikes after that. Another reason he was riding the Sager chainless was that there were all these bureaucratic maneuvers threatening his eligibility to race. He would get frozen out of certain tracks, certain races, and there was one point where he was completely frozen out. There was a rival league that was formed and lured him away, and then drew the color line and kicked him out. And it was Harry Sager who paid the fine to have him reinstated to the LAW if Major would ride his bike. And there was so much trouble getting into these other races to compete against other people that was why in 1898 he really turned to the solo venture, which he didn't need to be admitted to anybody else's track or race to do it. It was just him against the clock. So he focused on setting speed records, and the most coveted was the 1 mile. And he went back and forth with McDuffie and a couple other people, but mostly him and McDuffie, lowering it from 1:35, 1:30, 1:35 to 1:32 to 1:22, and finally Major Taylor got it down to 1:19, and McDuffie said, "I retire." Track bikes don't have
Yeah.
brakes. You don't need brakes on the track. When the race is over on the track, you just sit up and slow down. Yeah.
And this is another Orient. This is, you know, Lynn was talking about the pacing. And, you know, pacing went from what we saw earlier of the human pacers with the 3 and 4 men, cycles to this. You know, and this was the Orient that I think was 1901 or something, or maybe it was in before the 1899. But this was one of the first ones.
There was steam power, there was
Yeah.
gasoline power, there were many permutations. They were really dangerous.
And this was some of the mayhem that happened on the track because of the need for more and more speed and having these motorized pacers, because these guys are going faster and faster. The danger of the motorbikes is really the cause of a lot of these accidents, because they were, this one was, I forgot where.
This is Waltham.
Yeah, it was Waltham track, right. So 2 people died on this particular occasion. There's also another one. This is actually a 2-person Orient, with 2 engine pacer. But there was also, ultimately, this was another death at Charles River Park that happened, where Harry Elks, who was a well-known pace, he was setting marks behind pacers, ultimately had a flat tire going, well over 45 miles an hour, and was then run over by one of the pace-making machines. And, I think that Major, at some point, really wanted out of the pace-making game, and, ultimately, he was more and more now people across, in Europe really wanted to see him race, and more it made sense for him to be on that, doing match racing against their champions across Europe, and ultimately, we don't have time to go through a lot of that history, but I think, in the book, it's really kind of leads to, just the way I think it was really important that the way he felt in Europe was kind of much different than the way he felt here in these States, where he was fighting against racism about and about the way the other riders were treating him. In Europe, he was really, treated as a king when he came to Paris in particular, and where he rode against their champion. And also in Australia, when he rode in a couple of seasons, he rode in Australia as well. So, in a way, it allowed him to continue to ride at the highest level, but he didn't necessarily need to continue to take the type of risks that were killing people on the track in the earlier years.
Yeah, they rolled out the red carpet for him in Europe, and that became a refuge for him. And like many other African-American celebrities in the early 20th century, think of the writer James Baldwin, the singer Josephine Baker. I'm not saying there was no racism in Europe. I think it was kind of a different brand. He was more of kind of a curiosity there, and not a threat.
Right. Just so a couple of, this was in Australia, the final showdown between Ford McFarlane and Major Taylor, meeting of the world's cycling giants. So, and I just want to close with this is in Worcester, thanks to Lynn and her community, and this is the statue that she was talking about earlier. In front of in the library, right?
It's outside the Worcester Public Library. Yeah, larger than life. He was only 5'7". This is bigger than that.
And this was one of the quotes that I love. So, anyway, I think if anybody would like to ask any questions, we'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lynn and Todd. Thank you so much.
I read the book a few years ago, and after I read the book, I went into Washington, and I went to the African American Museum, and there's a huge room of sports section, and there's no mention of him in there.
Yeah.
I was surprised. I even asked him what's going on, because obviously there's world recognition then, and there's mention of every athlete that you could possibly imagine going way back.
Oh,
And there's
I
no
have a-
mention of him at all.
Yeah.
I have a picture. There is a little. There is one little.
But
one
they-
That,
I-
that must be recent, because I was there maybe 5, 6 years ago, and there was nothing in there.
But
Because I
knew-
asked them.
Yeah, I know that they considered more, and I know that was something that they I remember talking to a friend who was talking with the creators at the time, and for whatever reason, they just didn't feel like that, that maybe he didn't have the status or the name recognition of other pioneers.
It might also have to do with them not having an artifact, like not having one of his bikes. They have somebody's, I forget which boxer they have, his gloves.
Yeah,
They have somebody's
right.
uniform. So
Jack Johnson, yeah, right. Yeah.
is that whose gloves they have? I think they, I have pictures though. I haven't been there myself, but other people have sent me pictures of him. And another interesting thing is in another section of that same museum, when it talks about African Americans in the military, there's a picture of a bunch of brass, including Major Taylor's grandson, who was a
Right.
brigadier general.
Right.
So there's a couple generations of Taylors in there.
Bike Park in Waltham, do you know the years that was operating? And also, did he race there?
The Waltham Park, yeah. I think it was 1893, I think it opened, maybe.
I'm looking for Larry.
I know.
Oh, Larry took off? Okay. I don't know the answer to that. John said that the Waltham track closed in 1904 after that fatal crash, and that Taylor did race there. It's mentioned in Taylor's autobiography.
But I do think they promoted the track as the first one that was only devoted solely to bicycle racing, as opposed to like Charles River that had multiple things that were going on there.
Did Major Taylor and Kitty Knox know each other?
I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know if they ever crossed paths. If it's not anything, she's not mentioned in Major Taylor's autobiography. Same era, but they were in different parts of the sport. He was elite professional racer, and she did a little bit of racing as an amateur, but she was mostly recreational. So it was kind of different spheres.
Yeah.
Todd and Lynn, thanks for a great talk. That was super entertaining. Does anyone ever go back with the original equipment from 1900 and try to replicate that 1 mile record?
I've never heard of that. Yeah.
That I don't know. I would think a mile is done faster than that.
Oh, yeah,
nowadays.
but I mean-
Nowadays, yeah.
But do you mean sort of on the same
On the same
gear
equipment.
and yeah. I don't think so, but I don't know. I've never heard of that.
I'm curious about Fitchburg. Did he race in Fitchburg?
Fitchburg.
About Fitchburg.
Yeah.
Well, he was sponsored by Ivor Johnson bicycles that were made in Fitchburg, and I know I've seen a clipping from the Fitchburg paper where this was like a gossipy little item on page 2 of what's going on in town. Major Taylor's coming to check out some wheels being built for him here. Wheel was the term for the whole bicycle back then. Whether he actually raced in Fitchburg, I don't recall.
Because that was kind of later, right? The famous Fitchburg race.
Oh, the
was
Fitchburg
much-
Long Show Classic was
yeah,
much later, yeah. And a different type of race, too.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't even know if there was a track in Fitchburg.
yeah, I'm not sure.
I'd like to thank both authors there and everyone here. I am visiting, and I went to the museum today for the first time. I'm a member of the Major Taylor Phoenix Cycling Club,
That's great.
and I can say that when I get back on Friday, I took photos and I've been intently listening, and I will be sharing with my colleagues about what I have experienced here. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Wow, yeah. Thank you. It's great to see Phoenix represented here. Say hi to Donna for me.
Can you talk a bit about his training regimen, like miles per week, or what? Did he do a typical regime, or what was that like?
By the time he moved to Worcester as a teenager, he was already sort of the unofficial black champion. He had been in a lot of segregated races, mostly in the Midwest. And he really had some leg power, but you can see in some of the younger pictures where he's pretty scrawny on top, and then later he's more muscular. Track, you need more upper body than road racing, for example. So I know that weightlifting was part of his training. Boxing was part of his training. Boxing was a lot more popular then. There's pictures of him in like an impromptu match in the infield of a race of a velodrome in Paris. I know he was very disciplined about his diet. I think I always thought this was a boxing thing too, but I guess it extended to other sports. Raw eggs was part of his diet. And then as he got older, every season, it was harder and harder for him to get the winter weight off. And you see it in the pictures of him his last few seasons in Paris, 1907, 08, and 09. And they wrote about it too, that he was, heavier. You see these lines in his face at the age 28.
He did do a lot of cross training though, which is interesting. I think we kind of think of that as sort of more modern in some ways, but I mean, he did, like bands and pulleys and things like that. That was popular at the time, and so it wasn't just. I don't know whether they had like really specified workouts for like a track cyclist would in today's times. I think they were still filling it out a little bit about what was because also they were, I mean he really shouldn't have been riding like a 30-mile race against another racer. I mean that wasn't his specialty. He was a true sprinter, and that was his real gift. So I mean, and that's really almost anaerobic, and so sometimes they would put him in these situations that really weren't to his favor. But I think that training-wise, he was really doing a little bit of everything, and because they were all. The science of the time was very, people were writing about it at the time about nutrition and about the ways to, but the whole idea of human performance was really pretty new at that period of time.
We talked about the George Street hill climb, which is a race we do in Worcester, and we have it on George Street. It's a really steep hill, short and steep, because Major Taylor rode that hill. Sometimes people say, well, Major Taylor trained there, but that's not exactly it. That hill was like a known challenge to cyclists even before he moved to Worcester, so he was told, hey, any cyclist worth his salt ought to be able to get up this hill. So he went out to give it a try, and it was noted in the newspaper. And then when other people did it too, they got their name in the paper. But I don't think it was something he regularly did as training. But it speaks to his versatility, that he could get up that hill.
Yeah, right. In a big gear, probably too.
It's the kind of hill that stands up and laughs at you.
I had read somewhere that he innovated a handlebar and stem system that would let him experiment with like his sprinting crouch and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Yeah.
To this day, that's called a Major Taylor stem. Yeah. Whether he was the actual inventor of it, I don't think has been pinned down, but it's kind of an outrigger adjustable thing, so that he could get lower and more aerodynamic. And whether or not he was the actual inventor of it, he definitely was a pioneer in the use of it. You can see in some of the pictures comparing him to some of the other racers that he's the one down low and flat and aerodynamic. So yeah, like I said, to this day, those you can find them on eBay. Look up Major Taylor stem. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Todd and Lynn. Thank you, everybody, for coming.